Good afternoon. This is still boiling hot summer in Japan. Thank you for coming all the way. We will start the special seminar organized by Renewable Energy Institute. Can a 100% renewable energy system be realized? I will serve as the moderator. I am Takase of Renewable Energy Institute. Thank you. So very kind. Thank you. More than 30 years ago, when I was a high school student on NHK, if the global warming occurs, this will happen, and that is really folding before us. That is what scientists are saying today. We should believe that they will all come true. So the Earth is boiling. Most of the areas in the world are trying to decarbonize. Many of the world are trying to realize net zero. There is still opportunity for Japan to be the leader. However, there is no time to lose. According to IPCC, already renewable energy is cheap technologically. Many of the renewables are efficient and economic anyway, and therefore to thoroughly, fully deploy renewable does have a huge potential. There are uncertain emerging technologies. Of course, it is important to work on new technology, but rather than relying on uncertain future technology and doing nothing now, it is like spending a lot with your credit card and buying lotteries in belief that you might win money by luck. So by CCS, realizing net zero by 2050, rather than being dreamful like that, there are many actions already in the world. There are realistic, practical decarbonization. How to execute that in Japan? Realistic, practical, scientific actions. We would like to talk about that. Who has been an advisor to DOE and DOD in the US, who has been advising more than 70 countries, including businesses and government, advising on security, energy, amongst many others. We have Dr. Amory Lovins as the speaker. Also from our institute, we have Chair of Executive Board with Thomas Koberger. We will look at the latest science and technology. What are the messages for our country? After that, we do have ample time for discussion. As you have come all the way to this place, there is an opportunity for questions and answers. This is physical, face-to-face only, no online. This is a precious opportunity, and later we shall be loading the recording of this event. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. So first of all, our Chair of Executive Board, Thomas Koberger, will talk about the energy system, 100% renewable energy. Am I wrong? Corrections. Amory is always ready, so you go first.
Konnichiwa, Robinson Emeritus. Koberger Sensei and I are honored to explore with you today some exciting opportunities for achieving 100% renewable electricity supply in Japan. Experience abroad proves that this is practical and economically attractive, and I'm so grateful that you have taken time from your very busy days to come join this conversation. We both look forward to learning from your experience. Renewables are now more than 90% of the world's net additions of generating capacity, but Japan's national policy has long supported uneconomic thermal power stations. More than a third of Japan's nuclear capacity has closed. Most of the rest remains in limbo. Solar power grows, but only sluggishly under long-standing anti-competitive policies, and wind power remains largely suppressed. Yet, in just 11 years after 311, savings plus renewables displaced 129% of Japan's lost nuclear output if adjusted for GDP growth, or 95% if not adjusted. So Japan's old nuclear market has already vanished before more reactors could restart, if restart even had a business case, or if the owners even had to present one. Nuclear power is indeed so uneconomic that free markets don't buy it, and worldwide it adds each year only as much capacity as renewables add every 2 days or so. Continued energy efficiency gains would simply repeat a half-century of history. Around 1975, US government and industry all said that primary energy productivity, the GDP produced per unit of primary energy used, could never rise. A year later, I heretically suggested it could rise 257% in 50 years. So far, it's risen 154% in 47 years. Yet, just the innovations already added by 2010 can raise energy productivity by another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. Today, that looks conservative, because optimizing buildings, vehicles, and factories as whole systems, not as piles of isolated parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns. This is true even in Japan, where typically efficient industries are offset by unimpressive road vehicles and inefficient buildings. So Kaizen can still eliminate much muda and mura and muri. The US energy future that our synthesis Reinventing Fire proposed 12 years ago has since unfolded. We showed how, by using only part of the integrative design potential, US electricity use could shrink 25% by 2050, despite all electric automobiles and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. This quadrupled electric efficiency would save kilowatt hours at an average cost 1/10 their retail price of the electricity that is saved. So we should have chosen far more efficiency. Japan's electricity saving potential may not be very different, especially in buildings. For example, this eye chart, which you can study later in the PDF file of my slides, compares technical efficiency benchmarks for big new office buildings in 3 efficiency categories and 4 color-coded countries. The Japanese buildings in blue are rather similar to their US counterparts in white, but the most efficient buildings in this right-hand column need 3 to 5 times less cooling, and for each unit of cooling, they need 4 to 13 times less electricity than the standard practice. And they do this with better comfort, lower construction cost, and better space efficiency. Whatever exists is possible. More specifically, integrative design let our retrofit of the Empire State Building save 38% of its energy with a 3-year payback. 3 years later, our cost-effective retrofit saved 70%, making this half-century-old government complex more efficient than what was then the best new US office or the best Japanese small office retrofit, where Takanaka saved 72% of the energy in their Higashikanto office without disturbing the occupants. And this building is very typical of many Tokyo commercial buildings. It could be further improved, and it could help inspire deep retrofits nationwide. And yet both of these buildings are only 1/3 as efficient as RMI's passive office, using 1/9 the normal amount of energy in the coldest North American climate zone. This German building uses 2/5 less energy still. All these technologies existed more than a decade ago. What mainly improved is not so much technology as design, the way we choose and combine the technologies. Integrative design can make energy savings several times bigger at lower cost by using not more but fewer devices, and not fancier but simpler devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. Familiar resources like metal ore bodies and oil reservoirs are finite and depletable assemblages of atoms. But energy efficiency resources are infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Across all sectors, integrative design could raise energy productivity by about 5-fold worldwide and by probably at least 4-fold in Japan, especially if integrative designers were paid for what they save, not for what they spend. Newer techniques are especially exciting. For example, the best big building air conditioning systems in Singapore are 3 times as efficient as the Japanese norm. They cost less, they work better, but they may just have become obsolete. In an experimental 10 square meter shaded pavilion, Singaporeans stayed comfortable outdoors without fans, without breezes, without cooling or drying the hot, humid air. How? Well, people were cooled solely by absorbing far infrared radiation from their bodies into vertical panels cooled to 23 to 25 degrees by circulating cool water, and separated by the humid air, from the humid air by a thin plastic film. This arrangement delivered comfort in 32-degree air and 80% relative humidity. Such modest cooling can be done passively by special surfaces, proven also in Japan, that radiate infrared rays to the sky, providing Kanto or Kansai summer comfort with no or almost no electricity and with far lower peak electric loads. Industry uses half the world's energy and electricity. My team's latest $60+ billion worth of industrial redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit, paying back in a few years, and far outperforming the brown zone in the upper left, where most energy service companies deliver disintegrated design. Our new industrial projects generally found 40 to 90% energy savings at nearly always lower than normal capital cost. For example, fully deploying better pipe and duct design in buildings and industry can save 80 to 90+% of the friction and therefore of the pump and fan power. If everyone did this, it could save half the world's coal-fired electricity, with paybacks typically less than a year in retrofit and instant in new construction. But this is not yet in any standard engineering textbook, government study, industry forecast, or climate model. Why not? Because it's not a technology. It's a design method. And few people yet think of design as a way to scale rapid change. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. And notice that this pump is raised up on a plinth to meet the pipe rather than dipping the pipe down to the floor to meet the pump and back up again with 4 elbows, 4 right angle bends, and much friction. To eliminate elbows and their friction, we lay out the pipes first, then the equipment. We lay out supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend mines, not pipes. And each unit of flow or friction saved in the pipes saves 10 units of fuel, carbon, pollution, and cost at the thermal power station. Japan's mighty industrial sector makes and uses copious energy-intensive materials, like the cement and steel that now release 15% of the world's CO2. But just elegantly frugal structural design can profitably save at least half of the world's cement and steel. For example, substituting tension for compression structures typically gives better strength, beauty, and cost with 1/8 the tons. Fabric forms can save half the concrete, plus further weight savings when you need less strength to hold up less weight. 3D printing of this airy bridge can eliminate most of the weight of the concrete structures that mainly support themselves, not their payloads. The stainless steel bridge is 3D printed. And floor slabs are half the total weight of a typical mid or high-rise building, but a 5 centimeter thick folded concrete slab or a shallow vaulted dome can replace a 30 centimeter thick flat slab and cost less and save 3/4 of the cement and all of the steel. Then a new building with thin floor slabs and better energy design can save another 15% of the core structural materials and 3/4 of the energy use, while increasing net rentable space by a stunning 55%, as in this Singapore building. How? Well, designing out a vertical meter of mechanical plenum at each story and using the thin slabs then allows you to fit 3 stories of normal 2.8 meter ceiling height into the vertical space now used for 2 stories. Cost, complexity, and time all fall dramatically. And imagine how this works at Japanese land prices. So most of our electricity is still wasted, and we can also use it more timely. For example, a typical household in Hawaii uses appliances at different times of the 24-hour day, and roughly half the use is under the yellow curve showing the daily solar output. But the utility, having tried and failed to prohibit solar hookups, then wanted to confiscate any leftover solar production without paying for it. Well, angry customers could then respond with smarter appliances that move 80 or 90% of the household loads conveniently into the solar hours, costing the utility nearly all its intended windfall and most of its ordinary revenue. So this anti-solar tariff is a well-aimed boomerang that will actually speed and expand solar adoption by educating and annoying the customers so they leave the grid faster. Happily, RMI was able to help the Hawaiian parties to agree on more sensible strategies, but it is now economic there, just like Japan, for new houses not to connect to the grid. RMI's hourly simulation for the Texas grid in summer 2050 systematically combined 8 kinds of demand response with dramatic effect. To smooth the magenta curve of daily net load, that is the green load curve minus the solar and other renewable generation, we engaged electric vehicles, home plug loads, residential and commercial domestic hot water, plus heating and cooling controls. And together, we found these can eliminate the steep ramping of the evening load, conveniently cut the summer daily load range in half, save 1/4 of the non-renewable capacity, make renewables a third more valuable, and repay their investment cost in about 5 months. This summary of 14 years of experiments with 4 kinds of time-dependent electricity pricing on 3 continents show peak reductions above 30% or even above 50%. So demand response is an extremely large resource as well. Even with cheap US fracked gas, new and old combined cycle gas-fired power plants no longer have a business case. Their market is collapsing because all of their outputs, energy, capacity, ramping and flexibility, and ancillary services like voltage and frequency stability, can be provided better, faster, and cheaper by locally customized, carbon-free, clean energy portfolios, combining demand-side, renewable, and storage assets. U.S. investors promptly noted this analysis and canceled most of their planned gas plants. And by 2 years ago, only a single new gas plant in the entire United States could be briefly economically justified. Of course, U.S. gas costs far less than Japanese LNG, and neither country's gas price includes the value of carbon or of escaped methane or of price volatility in the fuels. So without burning gas or coal, how can we keep the electric grid reliable as it becomes renewable? Well, without fossil-fueled backup, in red, there are 10 carbon-free ways, conceptually sketched here, to balance a renewably powered grid reliably across all timescales. Our choices are not limited to big batteries in magenta. These typically come last, not first, so we need not wait for a storage miracle, although some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. The 2 biggest resources at the left, negawatts and flexawatts, are both about 3 times bigger than commonly assumed, but there are 8 others too, and some of them are very big. For example, the electric vehicles now taking over the world auto market are starting to charge bidirectionally, and they could add at least several gigawatts per year of storage in a country like Japan, probably more, plus other valuable services. 2 years ago, one European aggregator was earning 1/8 million yen per auto battery per year by selling back to the grid 13 of 21 available services from vehicle to grid. Australia now gets more frequency stabilization from batteries, demand response, and other inverter-driven resources than it does from coal plants, making that valuable service 39% cheaper in the past year, and soon electric cars will join that supply. So Japan's policy of modest energy savings and favoring thermal power plants continues to be presented as necessary for energy security. We are still told that only coal, gas, and nuclear stations can keep the lights on because they are 24/7, while wind power and solar power are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But variable does not mean unpredictable. Here is how accurately the French grid operator in one stormy winter month forecast 1 day ahead the actual output of the country's wind farms. They would be happy to forecast demand so accurately. A decade later, Danish wind farms can reliably bid into the day-ahead hourly auctions, just like fossil fuel capacity, because the forecasting is now so accurate. Indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant power plant fails, you lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, often for weeks or months. Grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variation of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. Let me illustrate this with a difficult case that RMI analyzed 13 years ago. The big, nearly twice the size of Japan, hot, often humid state of Texas, which has virtually no hydroelectricity, a mainly Kansai-like climate, and a nearly isolated grid. The varying loads that were then forecasted for a summer week in 2050 do become smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use, but they still need more than 30 peak gigawatts, making that electricity 86% from wind and photovoltaics and 14% from dispatchable renewables and a little bit of biogas and biomass, also dispatchable. That leaves surplus power to charge ice storage air conditioners and smart electric automobiles. Then recovering that distributed storage when needed and filling the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand in orange yields 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only 5% left over to decarbonize other sectors, yielding great economics even at today's prices. Some grid operators already do such choreography routinely. Compared with Japan's renewable power, I believe 22% of consumption last year, Germany, Britain, and Ireland already have been about half renewably powered. Denmark, 84%, Scotland, 99%, Spain, 46%, Portugal, 66%, all without adding bulk storage and with superior reliability. These operators have learned to run their grids the way the conductor leads the Tokyo Philharmonic. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously creates beautiful music. In Germany, 3 years ago, the maximum percentage of total electricity demand met by variable renewables, that is photovoltaics and wind, shown as a red dot for each week of the year, exceeded 50% at some time in almost every week. In about half the weeks, it reached somewhere between 80% and nearly 100%. Nuclear and coal phase-outs continued. The lights stayed on. German engineers are very good, but so are Japanese engineers. In fact, quadrupling renewables share in Germany, the gray bars, came with more reliable electrical service. The white graph shows a common measure of power outages, fluctuating with storms, but trending generally downwards. And we see the same in Texas, where installed wind power in red tripled in 6 years, while the reserves needed to cover shortfalls of wind power in blue fell by about half. And these trends have then continued for at least another 7 years, and I think they continue also today. Prosperous Denmark has among the world's most reliable grids because it is more than 4/5 renewably powered, expecting 100% by 2030. Denmark has nearly completed its journey from centralized power stations in red, thermal stations, to distributed wind turbines in blue and mostly farm waste cogeneration in brown. Central electricity only plant's output in 1980 was 99.9% gone by 7 years ago. While GDP grew 72%, Denmark used 24% less electricity, more than twice as efficiently. They cut carbon intensity 64% in 12 years, while renewable output rose by more than 10 times. So last year, only 16% of Denmark's generation was fossil fueled, none was nuclear, and yet profits, reliability, and resilience all improved. Denmark is heading for all renewable energy of all kinds by 2050, and they're experimenting with resilient so-called cellular grid architectures that keep the lights on even if the power lines go down. In 2021, the U.S. National Renewable Energy Lab published a supply-side analysis of how much more it could cost the United States to go from 90 or 95% to 100% renewable electricity by 2050. And you see in the last 4 bars in the upper left that the average cost increases very little. Now, in the lower left, you see a steep rise in the marginal cost. Why is that? It's probably an artifact of the models omitting many important solutions, which I have summarized already. For example, the same national lab competed efficiency in buildings against storage very conservatively and found that this can cut investments by about a factor 10 by displacing long-duration hydrogen storage and green electricity to make it. In 4 key U.S. regions, the supposed need for long-duration storage, for example, by hydrogen or ammonia, simply disappears. In the region with the climate most like Kanto, it decreases by 97%. 2 weeks ago, a major U.S. government study showed how to save up to 41% of U.S. buildings' energy use and 91% of their carbon emissions, and found this would cut power system costs by over $100 billion each year. That's a third of the total cost of decarbonizing the U.S. grid. Now in Japan, and for 82% of global power generation, unsubsidized renewables, solar in yellow, wind in blue, are now the least cost source of new bulk electricity. Bloomberg found that the cheapest way to meet a flat load is now solar or wind power, plus backup, which can be demand side, storage, renewable, or fueled. Putin's war makes avoiding insecure fossil fuel imports at volatile prices even more valuable. As efficiency helps renewables save fossil fuels faster, renewables are beating thermal power almost everywhere with stable and several-fold lower costs and true energy security, especially from distributed generation. Our home's rooftop solar power works with or without the grid. So should everyone's. Resilient connections to the grid should be the standard design, especially in a country with earthquakes and typhoons. Flourishing microgrids, mainly to improve resilience, are now being delivered as a turnkey service in 28 of the United States. And this issue is no longer about economics. Japan's rooftop solar has cost less than grid power since 2014. 3 years ago, Japan's utility-scale solar and wind power still cost twice world norms, as in these comparisons. In 2020 alone, China added nearly twice as much solar and wind capacity as Japan had ever built cumulatively, but now market forces are becoming stronger. And today, Japan's new solar electricity costs less than 10 yen per kilowatt hour. That's about half the operating cost of fully amortized coal-fired or LNG plants. New solar also beats restarted nuclear plants. So Japanese solar and wind power outcompete existing thermal stations and should be dispatched first, before inflexible nuclear plants, to unburden customers and boost Japan's competitiveness. But national and utility policies still shield legacy assets from competition by doing the opposite of economic dispatch. So curtailment, that is, idling existing renewable plants in order to run costlier nuclear and fossil plants, has now spread to every region of Japan except Tokyo. The claim that nuclear expansion would enhance energy security is contradicted by France's continuing nuclear shortfalls, which caused a deeper gas shortage in Europe than Putin's war did. For example, last year, in 62% of the hours, over half of French nuclear capacity produced no electricity, not because of post-Fukushima Daiichi shutdowns as in Japan, but because of technical and maintenance failures in the aging fleet. Japan is not immune from the same issues. Nor is nuclear power even helpful for climate, just the opposite. Efficiency and renewables generally cost less to build and less to run than just operating existing nuclear plants, let alone building more, big or small. So buying efficiency and renewables whenever they cost less than running fossil fuel plants or restarting and running nuclear plants will save the most yen, and it will displace the most carbon per yen and per year. However, Japan now lags all other G7 peers on the path to net zero and needs to speed efficiency and nearly double its pace of renewable additions, starting by opening the grid to the 182 gigawatts of renewables now awaiting a connection. Remote grid-connected generators must also compete with local generation that can move very swiftly. At the end of 2018, coal-dependent Vietnam had 0.1 gigawatts of solar power. 2 years later, it had 16.5 gigawatts, the most in East Asia, 1/3 more than the 2025 target set just months earlier. 9 of that 16 gigawatts was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures. That's equivalent to building half the nation's coal plants in 1 year. 72% of that solar power was installed just in the month of December, before a 9-month window closed for a juicy feed-in tariff. And in fact, most of that was installed in the last week of December. Amazing. Distributors race to catch up so all that unforecast solar output can feed back to the grid. Coal, no longer getting automatic loan guarantees, is struggling, and this revolution was almost all privately financed by independent producers under standard power purchase agreements. The government just ripped up its forecasts. A similar revolution is emerging from China's whole county rooftop solar program. Rooftop PVs were not a thing 6 years ago in China. By 2 years ago, China had 27 gigawatts of rooftop solar, growing 8 gigawatts a year. Now rooftop photovoltaics are 30% of the total installed solar power capacity. They're headed for about 95 gigawatts, probably more, by 2025, often encouraged to avoid grid costs, increase resilience, improve public health, and provide local jobs. Finally, perhaps the best utility study of grid integration is by the 99.999% reliable, 62% renewable German grid operator 50 Hertz and its Belgian partner Elia. They capably analyzed Europe's Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums, the cloudy and calm periods, often claimed to require months or seasons of electricity storage. With sensible east-west interconnections, these bad renewable conditions turned out to need backup power for only 1 or 2 weeks per year maximum, totaling about 6% of winter electricity use. That little is readily supplied by existing gas-fired capacity, burning green molecules like hydrogen made at other times from surplus solar and wind. The often claimed needs for enormous amounts of very long-term storage was not found, partly because this study included more of the 10 solutions I sketched earlier, namely moderately efficient use, electric vehicle integration, heat pumps, behind-the-meter batteries at home, and demand response. The study found that just demand response in Europe could cut renewable power's undersupply or oversupply days by 90%. There are more than 700 peer-reviewed analyses of 100% renewable electricity or energy systems now published worldwide. But these are just about choices of what details will be for the last 10 or 20% of supply around 2050. We don't need to know those details now. We only need to know that we have ample and attractive options to choose from. And we already know that. The options will only improve, but we need not choose them today. As the climatologist Ken Caldera wrote, controversies about how to handle the end game should not overly influence our opening moves. I hope that these little examples will help convey why experts in many other countries do not think an all-renewable electricity system in Japan should be unduly difficult. And I look forward to our discussion. ご清聴誠にありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Amory. So, muda, all the muda seals and stamps, it was shown on the slide. Indeed, economically, we are about to waste quite a lot. And I am sure the audience has understood. We would like to think scientifically, and not only utilization of state-of-the-art technology, but change the design. The perspective of designing, we understand the importance. Half of the coal would no longer become necessary. That is a shocking statistics. Thank you very much for the insight. If Thomas is ready, Thomas Kobege will talk about 100% renewable energy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Amory, for starting with the important thing that energy efficiency is often the absolute lowest cost prerequisite for an efficient energy system, economically efficient because it's energy efficient. And it also helps anyone who's trying to solve the problem of supplying the energy, that if the energy is efficiently used, there will be less energy resources required to supply the system, and it will be easier to balance and support. That is by far the most important thing, and it's good that you started by describing the importance of intelligent, integrative design rather than just putting out a lot of new gadgets into the energy system. I will make 2 supplementary points. I will describe how the cost decrease of renewables have made renewables the most competitive source of electricity, which also Amory described. I will also show how that has helped develop technologies such as batteries that will also be useful to stabilize the electricity grid. And my second point will be, this is also making possible the replacement of fossil fuels in other sectors using low-cost renewable electricity. So while Amory focused on the electricity system, I will make the point that you can have a 100% renewable energy system, replacing also the fossil fuels in other sectors. And the process that has made this possible is the industrial learning by experience that has reduced the cost of electricity generation from solar and wind. A former colleague of mine at my Swedish university, Professor Claes Otto Wehne, published a report on the OECD in the year 2000, where he made this point that this is something that is possible. He showed, using data from the late 20th century, how the cost had come down for wind and solar with increased experience. This diagram is a bit difficult because it says experience curves and you see straight lines. And the reason is the mathematical trick of using logarithmic scales. Then what would be a curve in a linear diagram becomes a straight line in this logarithmic diagram. And straight lines have the seductive, unavoidable tendency to make you believe that you can extrapolate the lines, that they will continue to be straight lines. And sometimes that is justified, and in this case it is. And his argument was that if just a few countries continued to subsidize solar and wind while they were still more expensive than conventional thermal power, the cost for solar and wind electricity generation would come down to the point where they would be economically competitive with thermal power without any further subsidies. That was his proposal in this book. And what we've seen, what we've seen since is that indeed some countries have subsidized solar and wind power. If you look at the solar development here, you can see that the deployed PV capacity in the world has risen exponentially during the decades, the last 3 decades. Here, Japan was early in the late 20th century deploying solar PV. Japan had the most advanced solar PV manufacturing in the world at the time. Then Germany started subsidizing solar, and for the first few years of this century, German households paid for a lot of the industrial experience that was accumulating, first in Europe, later in China. China also started to deploy solar PV and is now by far the leading country in the world. The US is number 2, and Japan is in solar not so bad. Japan is number 3. As a result, costs did come down, and 2016 was a magnificent year for decreasing the cost of renewable electricity. In February, in Peru, solar electricity was purchased at a price below 5 US cents per kilowatt hour, which was then considered tremendously low. Some people said this is not possible, it's too low, it won't happen again for a long time. But already a couple of months later in May, in Dubai in the Middle East, they managed to procure solar electricity at below 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And before the end of the year in September, in the neighboring emirate, they came down below 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And in Mexico, in the following year, in 2017, there was solar electricity purchased below 2 cents per kilowatt hour, below $20 per megawatt hour. In Portugal, in southern Europe, we came down to below 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour, euro cent though. And then in 2021, the contract in Saudi Arabia at around 1 cent, which I think is still the world record in publicly announced procurement price for solar electricity. And 1 US cent per kilowatt hour, that is very cheap. Wind energy increased in a similar way, has not yet passed 1,000 gigawatt, or has passed this summer, but had not at the end of last year. For wind power, it's the same. Germany paid a lot in the beginning of the century. Since 2005 approximately, China has taken off and is now by far the country with the highest installed capacity of wind power. The US is number 2. Japan is not on this list. Here we have Germany, India, Spain, and United Kingdom as the top countries in the world. Costs were also coming down in 2016. We saw in Morocco in North Africa prices between 25 and 30 US dollars per megawatt hour, 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, and the world record still, I think, for publicly announced contract price is from Mexico, where Enel promised to deliver below $18 per megawatt hour. Offshore wind, which is now on the agenda in Japan, was for long considered to be a source of electricity with a huge potential, but unavoidably high cost. Here too, costs and prices came down during 2016. In the summer in Europe, there was a procurement of the Dutch coast where Danish company Dong, now Ørsted, won a contract with a price of just above 70 euros per megawatt hour. It was then considered record low, but it's still high. Nothing happened in August, but in September, Swedish power company Vattenfall won a bid of the Danish west coast with a price of only 60 euros per megawatt hour. And nothing happened in October, but in November, Vattenfall won a contract off the Danish east coast at Kriegers Flak with a price below 50 euros per megawatt hour. Here again, you could make a straight line with a price declining 10 euros per megawatt hour every second month. If you extrapolated that line, offshore wind would have been for free by the summer of 2017. But in this case, extrapolation is not justified. It didn't work that well. It's interesting to note that Vattenfall was criticized for the Kriegers Flak bid because it was considered to be unrealistically cheap. The price was too low. But when the Kriegers Flak offshore wind power plant was inaugurated in September 2021, the head of wind power at Vattenfall could tell the board and the media that it had been completed faster than the time schedule and below budget. And she said, and that was despite the pandemic. And then she was quiet for a while, and then she said, well, maybe thanks to the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, only necessary visits were allowed at the construction site. So none of those bosses could go there and disturb them. They could work. Even though offshore wind did not become for free by 2017, the costs came down to the extent that you saw the first bids provided to build offshore wind power plants without any subsidies. In this case, Energi Baden-Württemberg and Danish Dong won a contract, or won a few contracts off the German coast, where they were granted the access to the sea area, they were granted a connection to the grid on shore, and they said, we will build the power plants, we will earn all the money we need by outcompeting thermal power plants in the German electricity market. Slightly later that year, the Dutch government in the Netherlands put up a competition where companies were not going to expect any subsidies. The competition was being experienced, promised to deliver a lot of electricity from a limited area of the sea, and showing you're brave enough to hand over hundreds of millions of euros to the Dutch government that you would not get back unless you actually delivered what you had promised to deliver. Vattenfall won that bid. The people who had been constructing the Kriegers Flak plant went over and started construction in July 2021 for this project that had now grown to 1.5 gigawatt, as one offshore wind project of 1.5 gigawatt, which can be compared to the Japanese ambitions at the moment. 1.5 gigawatt for one park, started construction in July 2021, and started to deliver the first electricity just about 1 year later, in August 2022. And now the whole plant is completed in the autumn of 2023. So it took 2 years to build 1.5 gigawatt of offshore wind. In Denmark in 2021, when they made a procurement, they were even greedier. The government said, you will have to pay us to be allowed to build offshore wind power. We will not subsidize anything, you will have to pay. And the winner, German RWE, were expected to pay 2.8 billion Danish crowns. That's about 250 million euros to the Danish government or customers before they were allowed to earn any money themselves. So wind power in just a few years went from being something that required subsidies to something that could pay subsidies to the consumers. And we saw in Britain, similarly, that the offshore wind power owners who had won contracts under a perceived subsidy scheme called Contracts for Difference, where there was a guaranteed price, they were now, during the high price period last year, they had to pay money back to the consumers because the market price was above the guaranteed price. So this shows how rapid the development has been, how important it has been to reduce the cost of electricity, and as Amory also showed, renewable electricity is now the cheapest source of new electricity almost everywhere in the world. But it's even better, because what has happened is that the price, the total cost and price of renewable electricity is below the price of crude oil. It's not that renewable electricity is cheaper than electricity produced from oil, it's the energy price of the renewable electricity that is cheaper than the energy price of crude oil. This has happened without people noticing because the world market price on oil is given in dollars per barrel, whilst the energy price of electricity is given in dollars per megawatt hour. And even though you don't have to be a professor to calculate one into the other, very few people bother. But I made this diagram, and this diagram is designed so that you can go onto the web and check what the current oil price is. It's now about $85 per barrel. And then you draw a line, you draw a line up to the diagonal. It's very fast here. Now it's stable. Up to that diagonal line and then out to the other axis, and you get the price in dollars per megawatt hour. And those of you with the capacity to memorize numbers more than 5 minutes, you remember that we have seen prices for solar and wind power in this range from $10 up to maybe $30 per megawatt hour, meaning that the total cost of solar and wind electricity is now just about half of the price of the energy in crude oil. And that makes it feasible to start replacing oil with renewable electricity in other sectors. And we have seen it starting. We see it in the automotive sector, where cars are increasingly electric. We see buses that are electric. Quite impressive here, Chinese city Shenzhen, where already a few years ago in 2018, 100% of the city buses were battery electric. There was more than 16,000. Ferries can be made battery electric. Short line like that, slightly longer like this between Sweden and Denmark. And you can have electric airplanes. I must admit I said very self-confidently 15 years ago at a conference that we will never see battery electric airplane because batteries are too heavy. I was wrong. There was a very polite young man in the audience. He didn't say anything in public, but afterwards he came up with a little note saying, check this website. I checked the website. It was a Chinese company already 15 years ago offering a two-seater aircraft that was battery electric and had a range of 2 hours. Since then, I've never said it's impossible. It is possible. Airbus, the European airplane manufacturer, put out this two-seater trainer aircraft in 2015. We now have companies like Heart Aerospace developing battery electric airplanes. And it's so attractive they managed to sell the planes before they even constructed them. When this happened, that batteries were increasingly deployed in the transport sector, the battery manufacturing increased. The battery manufacturers accumulated experience, learned to bring down cost, and they got economies of scale because the automotive industry needed a lot more batteries than we do for our laptops and our mobile phones. When Tesla built their first so-called gigafactory, the large battery cell factory to supply the Tesla cars, they roughly doubled the world's production capacity for lithium batteries. And of course, cost came down. And when costs came down, it became possible to deploy batteries also directly onto the electricity grid. And this first installation in South Australia, done by Tesla, was to ensure that the Australian grid would survive the sudden shutdown of large coal-fired power stations, which did happen because they were not so reliable as they sometimes claim they are, and there were very few large thermal power plants left, and therefore they needed this kind of backup in the system. Tesla supplied it. It worked very well, stabilized the grid, and reduced the cost of stabilization compared to having extra thermal power plants running just to keep the grid stable. There's been a lot of discussions in Europe, and it will soon be claimed in Japan, if it's not already claimed, that you need large, heavy, synchronous generators to keep the frequency stable in the grid. You may have heard that already. That is not true. This kind of inertia, the thing that makes it possible to keep the frequency stable in the grid, even if there is a sudden shutdown of a nuclear reactor or a power line breaks or something like that, can be done by batteries. And this Hornsdale plant battery plant in Australia was one that was given the sort of certification that it could provide this kind of service, often called inertia or short time frequency control. So it can be just as well done by batteries and power electronics as by large synchronous generators. And then, as Amory also said, we see now examples where gas-fired power stations traditionally used a couple of hours in the evening. If you cannot avoid it by improved energy efficiency and moving the load, you can use batteries. It's cheaper than keeping gas-fired power stations operating just a few hours per day. So this has been a quite dramatic development. And the batteries do not have to be large. Amory, again, referred to the use of cars that can be charged and discharged when they are connected to charging posts. Volkswagen has formed an electricity company called Elli. And their idea is that they will supply electricity to all Volkswagen electric car owners. And they will have in the contract that Elli is allowed to use a part of the capacity of the cars. Amory described similar business concept from another company. But what's most entertaining with the ambition of Volkswagen's Elli is they said that one day charging will be for free. They will be able to earn money by buying cheap electricity, selling expensive. They will provide grid stability services to the power company. You mentioned the number of different services you could provide. It's many that the grid companies are interested in. And they would earn so much money that this little electricity that the car owner actually needed to drive their car, they could be given for free. That's quite nice for car owners and for the grid. Fossil gas, natural gas, is also difficult to see how the price relates to the electricity price, because here the unit is even more strange. It's US dollars per million British thermal units. Anyone who recalculated that into dollars per megawatt hour today? Not so usual. But it can be done, and what used to be a typical price of about $8 per million British thermal units would still be at the level of solar and wind. But now, in the last year, we've seen a shift where gas has become more expensive, and now that is also at the level of oil, and thereby more expensive per unit energy than renewable electricity. And thus you can start using electricity to produce hydrogen to replace fossil gas. And many see the opportunity in the Middle East. Abu Dhabi, for example, see this opportunity to produce hydrogen and attract energy-intensive industries. In Europe, Portugal and Spain have the similar ambition. When you can produce hydrogen at a low cost from electricity, you can go one step further and produce liquid fuels, electrofuels. Then you need carbon dioxide. Today that's easily available because you burn a lot of fossil fuels, but you can also be more ambitious for the long term and say we will only use carbon dioxide from biomass, which is recently taken from the atmosphere. And in Europe there are two examples. One is the Danish toy manufacturer Lego, making those small plastic pieces. They've contracted a supplier of feedstock for their plastic manufacturing that is using electricity to produce hydrocarbons that are then used to produce these plastic pieces. And in Sweden, we have a project now being under construction where the intention is to use renewable electricity and carbon dioxide from a biomass fuel cogeneration plant to produce methanol, which is going to be sold to intercontinental shipping, where battery electric solutions are not yet viable. Coal is the cheapest of the fossil fuels, but still now in the range of the best solar and wind electricity in the world. And that gives the opportunity to use this hydrogen to replace coal in the reduction of iron ore into steel that can then be produced without carbon dioxide emissions in the process. There are other competing technologies to do this, and the demand for steel produced without emitting carbon dioxide will increase. In this project in northern Scandinavia, the first sponge iron was produced with hydrogen in June 2021. 2 months later, the first steel was produced, and another 2 months later, the first vehicle using this steel was constructed. Can be done. What did you say? Things that exist in reality are not impossible. Right. So these learning curves did prove to be possible to achieve. Solar and wind power is now cheaper than thermal power, often even cheaper than continuing to operate existing fossil-fueled and nuclear power stations. We can see these diagrams made where wind, solar, offshore wind has become cheaper. Coal is no longer becoming cheaper, and nuclear has become more expensive in the recent years for different reasons. And in addition to PV and onshore wind, we should also note what Claes Otterviende did not have in his diagram, that with the electrification of the transport sector and the increased production of batteries have also become dramatically cheaper. They cost about a tenth now of what they did a decade ago. The International Energy Agency in Paris, which most of you know of and that's globally respected in many ways, they have, on the other hand, been criticized over the years for underestimating the future development of solar and wind. If they are still underestimating solar or wind, then we're in for something really dramatic. Because now, since about a year, in the projections made by the International Energy Agency, they show, for example, this one from a recent report, that solar will become the largest capacity for electricity generation in gigawatt in the world, passing first hydro, then gas, and then coal before 2027. That's not many years into the future. Solar will then have the highest capacity. This is really showing a disruptive change of the global electricity system. But again, it is not only a matter of electricity. Low-cost electricity can also be used to replace fossil fuels in other sectors. And that means that today, one could even say that it's profitable to avoid taking the risk of facing unmanageable rates of climate change. But it does require a lot of intelligent people who understand the opportunities and actually use them. And that's not necessarily going to happen. But if a lot of us try, it might. Thank you.
トーマスさんありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Thomas. So we will go into the Q&A right away. So Emery, Thomas, please do take your seats in the front. Thank you for waiting. Later on, the recording of the event shall be loaded. So please understand that this will be recorded and be made public. Please kindly tell us your name and affiliation. Thank you very much for the state-of-the-art information. I have learned a great deal. My name is Mihashi Impress. Amory, I have a question about solar PV. The so-called solar power generation conversion rate is about 13% or so. But if it rises by 5%, or if it rises another further 10%, it will be very significant. What is your observation about the conversion efficiency in Japan, and what kind of research you are undertaking? And Thomas, I have a question about the wind. Offshore wind, 25% conversion ratio efficiency. If this rises by another 5% or another 10%, this would be significant. What is your observation about the conversion technology? Thank you. That was about the conversion efficiency. If you can advise us.
Capacity factor, the number of full load hours during the year.
It's a combination of efficiency. No.
Yeah.
設備利用率ということですか?
Did you mean capacity utilization?
Yes. What you asked about. And then if you look at offshore wind, the now experienced capacity factors for offshore wind can be much higher than 25%. The Equinor floating offshore wind off the Scottish coast over, I think it was a 5-year period, had a capacity factor above 50%, which last year was higher than the capacity factor of the nuclear power plants in France. So we see that offshore wind has the advantage of high capacity factors. And that makes up for the slightly more difficult and higher construction costs for offshore wind. Offshore wind power plants can also be higher and bigger. You have limitations for onshore wind because of the infrastructure, the sort of size of the equipment that can be transported on roads and so on. That is not the same for offshore wind. So offshore wind power plants are larger, which provide for economies of scale that reduces cost. So we're already there. We have higher capacity factors and we have got lower costs for offshore wind. And I think there are a span of solar technologies, if you want to.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the U.S. average. I think it might be 27% for photovoltaics, but it's published each month by the Energy Information Administration in a table that compares all renewable and all non-renewable sources of electricity. So if we exchange, Meishi, I can send you the URL for that. It does depend on where you are. Some climates are better than others, although the range for the entire continental United States is well under a factor 2. So it's not as big a range as one might expect between the sunniest deserts and the cloudiest forests. And you can also use all of the 10 grid balancing resources I described to make the capacity factor much less important. Also, of course, the solar production is during the day, but so are many of the loads. And when you make buildings more efficient, their thermal time constant increases. That is, the temperature inside the building changes more slowly because in effect you are amplifying the thermal mass of the building. So, for example, if you have a building so inefficient that it needs air conditioning, you can air condition it at night and store the cool in the building materials and then coast through the daytime without needing to air condition in the day. Although, of course, with solar production peaking in midday, the electricity may be cheaper then. So it may again be worthwhile. You have to think of the whole system and the uses as well as the supplies to find an optimal method of operation.
ありがとうございます。効率も
Thank you very much. The efficiency is rising, capacity factor is rising, and to think about the system as a whole was suggested. Thank you very much. And you want to do stone, scissors?
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions. Can you mention your name and the affiliation, please? My name is Mitsui. Thank you for the opportunity. I have 3 questions to Amory. My first question is, right now in Hawaii, how much is the ratio of renewables in Hawaii? Up until 2050, how much is the rate going to increase? Why is it I am paying attention to Hawaii? Like Japan, Hawaii is surrounded by the ocean, not connected to other countries or other countries' grids. So that's my first question. And my second question is, in Hawaii, how is Hawaii securing backup? In Japan, when we think about island like Kyushu, even though there is the hydro power generation or pumped power generation, it seems so that there is no backup. I think such kind of capacity is limited in Hawaii. How is Hawaii securing the backup is my second question, or balancing capability. And how much is the cost of balancing? So even if the power generating cost comes down, balancing cost and also transmission line cost need to be considered to come up with a total cost. So even if we are able to decrease or reduce the power generating cost, that would probably not reduce the total cost.
Did you get it?
Well, yeah, even if you have to have supplementary sources, you don't want to have only solar, you don't want to have only wind, you don't want to have only biomass. You want to have a combination of the different renewable sources, and they will support each other, as you said, the sort of conductor managing the ensemble of different renewable sources. There also this opportunity that Amory mentioned, that you may store not necessarily electricity or chemical energy in batteries. You can store heat and cool. You can have ice storage for air cooling, and where you charge and produce the ice when the electricity is readily available, and you use the ice and let the ice melt and cool the building when electricity is more expensive. But let me add that in the presentation where I did describe how electricity was used to produce fuels, that's quite a wonderful way of managing the variation in wind. The hybrid project, where fossil-free steel is to produce, that project has been largely developed in collaboration between the mining company and the power company. And they made an optimization of how much hydrogen storage should you have in northern Scandinavia to be able to use wind power to produce the hydrogen. And they came up with an optimal storage size of about 2 weeks of hydrogen. And that means that when there is little wind, and it's important that it's little, it's not no wind, because that very seldom happens, but little wind, then you produce steel from hydrogen stored in the storage. And then when there is a lot of wind, that's then when you start consuming electricity again and produce hydrogen. When there is little wind and no hydrogen is produced, there is still some wind available for the other primary electricity consumption that requires continuous supply and cannot be as flexible as the hydrogen production. In the case of the liquid electrofuel production for shipping, they will unavoidably have large storages of liquid fuel. And if you have periods of extremely high electricity prices, that liquid fuel can be used in gas turbines to produce electricity again. That will happen very seldom, and you can pay for the fuel that will be at least as expensive as oil in those periods, but it will be readily available and in storage because of the logistics of the supply to the shipping industry, and it will be the last resort if you have a shortage in the system. So because renewable electricity is now so much cheaper than fossil fuels, the cost of having a bit of demand management or even storage and even emergency production of electricity from electrofuels at rare occasions will still be a very small cost compared to continue using expensive fossil fuels. So it is important that the renewable electricity has become cheap, because it's not a little cheaper, it's much cheaper than conventional electricity generation, and you can afford to pay for all these balancing methods. But Amory's are the cheapest.
Well, and of course, this low renewable price is constant. Once you have bought the equipment, it behaves financially like an annuity. It doesn't have the volatility of, say, the gas price, which roughly doubles the actual price of the gas from what we see in the market, because in the market we don't value the volatility. but it is a risk, it is a cost, and it's worth about as much as in the United States as the gas price. Now, I just checked the Hawaiian numbers. Last year, about 29% of their generation of electricity was renewable. They were the first state to adopt a 100% renewable electricity target, which is to be reached by 2045, but I believe it's going faster than that. And the reason is rather obvious. The state is heavily dependent on oil with security and volatile price issues, as well as climate. And the electricity price averages about 3 times as much as the US average. So it's a bit like Japan. They have a very strong incentive. The difference is that in Japan, companies that strongly influence national policy get to determine how quickly we get off fossil fuel. But in Hawaii, the state government and the whole political system are closely aligned on a rapid transition to renewables. There are no vested interests being protected, and the regulatory arrangements have now been worked out with some help from RMI to make sure that the utility makes the most profit by saving its customers the most money. You raise a very important question about balancing costs. There is a table of data published, actually a graph, published every year by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California, showing different utilities analyses of balancing cost for firming, for example, wind power. And typically the balancing or firming cost is on the order of 1/3 to 1/2 US cent per kilowatt hour. That is, it's a modest fraction of a yen per kilowatt hour. It varies according to where you are, but not very much. It is perfectly true that you cannot simply compare the levelized cost of a kilowatt hour between, let's say, a renewable and a fossil or nuclear generator without thinking of the whole system costs. But actually, when you count firming or balancing costs, this tends to favor renewable energy. We see this in the data from places like Texas that unbundle all of the prices, so you can see what different services actually cost in the market. And there it turns out that, for example, the balancing cost for a big thermal station is around 2 or 3 times the balancing cost of a wind farm or a solar farm. The reason is rather simple when you think about it. A thermal station fails in very large chunks all at once, and often for weeks or months, and unpredictably. These are called forced outages. So to balance that resource, to make it fully reliable for the grid, you must have reserve margin, spinning reserve, and you incur both efficiency penalties and lifetime penalties from cycling this resource. In contrast, renewable resources are typically 99% technically available. That is, their rate of technical failure that is not predictable is extremely low. They are highly reliable. What you're worrying about is changes in weather or the rotation of the Earth that causes the sun to rise and set, that causes changes in the wind speed. But as I illustrated with the French data, these variations are highly predictable, And there are many small pieces in the granular solar or wind farm, any one of which is extremely unlikely to fail, and large numbers of which are extremely unlikely to fail in any technical sense. So the issue is a statistical one of balancing the output as predicted accurately by different kinds of renewables in different places to make sure that collectively they are meeting the need reliably. And the mathematics of this diversification is the same as for a stock portfolio. It doesn't take many renewable installations to produce a much more reliable total supply. And this is why the balancing costs are actually quite low for well-designed, well-operated, diversified portfolios of renewables. It's not just about whether that particular solar panel has a cloud casting a shadow on it at this moment, but it's the statistical behavior of a lot of generators in different places and responding to different weather, because they don't all see the same conditions at the same time. I hope this is clear. It's a point often not well understood in the electricity business. You might have some experience of this also.
No, I agree with what you said about the cost. If you look at if you have a competitive electricity market with clear rules regarding your commitment to produce and the economic liability for failing to produce, like we do have in Europe, which is the same for all. The rules of the liability for failing to deliver is the same for all kind of different power plants. And the largest risk to a power company is not a wind power plant breaking down, because that is a small thing, and the variation in weather is definitely not a problem because that's predictable. The thing that is the highest risk for a power company is a large nuclear power station or a large coal-fired power station that breaks down and stay out of operation for a long period in time. Because that's where you don't have any reserve capacity for these very large installations. And then you have to purchase that on the market. And as you have just lost a very large expected production unit, then the prices become very high on the market. So that's the highest risk to the owners.
Part of the reason this is not well understood is that the backup costs for big thermal plants were not well analyzed, and they were always socialized by convention as an inevitable system cost. Well, if you're treating them in that way, then you should also treat the backup for any composition of generators on the grid as an inevitable system cost, and simulate whether it's going to go up or down when you change the mix toward more renewables. And the answer is it goes down if you're analyzing it correctly. You might think of a big thermal plant as rather like a pet elephant. Elephants sometimes get sick or die, so you would need a spare elephant to do the same job if this happens to your pet elephant. And elephants eat a lot. It's rather expensive to keep a spare for something this big. And this is why the more granular units in diversified portfolios is a way to reduce backup cost and risk. I hope that such analyses are being done for Japanese conditions. But if they're done right, the answer is very clear from all around the world.
As long as you have the same rules for all different technologies, that's the fair way of dealing with it. I visited Hokkaido a couple of years ago and was told that if you wanted to operate a wind power plant, you had to install batteries to ensure that your ramping rate would not exceed a certain rate of increase or decrease power generation. And I looked at those ramping rates and made a very quick calculation. I said this will be extremely difficult for the nuclear Tomari nuclear power plant if they were to restart operation, to buy all the batteries necessary to manage that ramping rate criteria. And then the person from Hokkaido Electric looked at me for a while, and then he sort of said, but this only applies to wind power. So I think the important thing is that if you treat all these criteria necessary to make the grid stable and functioning, if you apply the same kind of technical criteria to any power plant, there will be an economic assessment made and the cheapest solutions will prevail.
Yeah, and it's not fair to apply one set of rules to thermal stations and another set of rules to renewables. You have to decide whether backup and firming are a system cost or a technology cost, and then use the same convention for all technologies.
ありがとうございます。そうですね、大きい。
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A big elephant can be only replaced by a big elephant, but a small ant can be replaced by a small ant. That was very easy to understand.
It's a big elephant with a lot of small ants. The example I gave with the battery frequency support systems, we have now experiences in Sweden where large nuclear reactors suddenly shut down. There is a frequency drop. And then a company that is controlling a lot of household batteries are ensuring that all these household batteries come in and keep the frequency within the limits. And that's procured by the transmission system operator. This company organizing all the household batteries, they have provided an offer in that bidding process. They won the bidding process, and they are now providing the service that otherwise large power plants would have done traditionally. So big elephants can be substituted by a lot of clever ants.
True, and in fact, in South Australia, it's also the case that the big battery you described is providing voltage and frequency stability to the whole grid connected there into other states faster and more precisely than could be done by rotating machines. And there was a case recently where one of the big lignite plants suddenly failed, and the battery responded so instantaneously that the coal plant that was supposed to provide that backup from 1,000 kilometers away had no chance even to begin. The job was already done before they woke up, basically.
ありがとうございます。様々な極端な気象の事例っていうのも。
So there's been many cases of extreme weather. According to the U.S. analysis, extreme weathers are being properly analyzed. And as a result, 100 renewable is possible. So what you need to do is go through the literature that covers all the researches. Takashi-san, thank you very much for waiting. My name is Takashi from Hosei University. Emori-san, Thomas-san, thank you very much for insightful presentations as always. So my question is mainly to Thomas-san, I believe. But I would also like to welcome a comment from Emori-san as well. The topic of today's seminar is can a 100% renewable energy system be realized? So as Thomas-san stressed, it's not about the electricity system. It's about the whole energy system. As you know, in Japan,
100%
A 100% renewable energy for electricity sector is not possible in Japan. So therefore, 100% renewable energy system as a whole is impossible, which I believe is a common sense in Japan. Let's say if we could achieve renewable electricity 100%, and even if electrification progresses, not all energy system cannot be shifted to 100% renewable. Thomas-san, you talked about vessels, airplanes, all of these could be electrified. However, heavy-duty vessels or big airplanes will not be electrified. So therefore, in Thomas-san's presentation, you talked about hydrogen, and you also talk about e-fuel as well. So let me start my question. So when you say hydrogen, 100% renewable hydrogen is not all. There are blue or gray hydrogen as well. So that is what Japanese government is working hard to import. And also in Japan, there is a high expectation towards CCS. So hydrogen and CCS, of course, if we use those, we cannot become 100% renewable energy system. And so there are different ways of achieving decarbonization. And I would like to know what European countries are thinking about the blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, and CCS. So future prospects, and what should Japan do? So non-electricity sector decarbonization, how much can we go in terms of implementation, shift to renewable? Can you give some comments on that?
Well, if you try to make hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCS, that hydrogen per unit energy will always be more expensive than the fossil fuel you started out with. That means that you will always have to rely on very strong policy incentive or taxes to make that hydrogen competitive with the fossil fuel you started out with. As I showed, renewable electricity is now often cheaper than oil, gas, and even coal per unit energy. That means that you can use electricity to produce hydrogen that will be cheaper than the fossil fuel you replace. And that will be competitive without any policy measures. I'm not saying that hydrogen produced from renewable electricity today is cheaper than hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, because there are remaining industrial learning and cost reduction processes that are needed for electrolyzers, for example. But it is very feasible that this will happen quite quickly. And one reason why it will happen quickly is that there are now in Europe and North America and China, not least, very large industrial projects to increase the deployment of electrolyzers, and that will unavoidably result in cost-decreasing industrial experience. Again, China is doing rather well in this process, developing a lot of different technologies for electrolysis of water into hydrogen and oxygen. And if you look at the market prices that are publicly available, the Chinese manufacturers seem to be very good and efficient. But there are lots of efforts in Europe and North America as well. So this will happen. It may not happen this year, but it will happen within a few years that hydrogen production from renewable electricity via electrolysis will be cost competitive with other ways of making hydrogen and with the fossil fuels that hydrogen is to replace. So I think that is the strategy that you see in North America and Europe. Maybe you would like to comment on the North American strategy.
Well, I was going to try something else. But
do something else. Huh?
Yeah, so less than 2 years ago, the Chinese chemical giant Baofeng had a 1 gigawatt photovoltaic farm that was producing hydrogen at $2.7 a kilogram. That's cheaper than the hydrogen they had been making from coal, so they were switching immediately to green hydrogen. And that is before some recent advances in electrolysis that now give us a clear path to $1 a kilogram hydrogen, green hydrogen. I think there's a broad consensus, including by Bloomberg New Energy Finance analysts, that green hydrogen in this decade will be cheaper than any form of fossil-fueled hydrogen. Now, that said, I think Japan's ambitions to make green hydrogen are far in excess of likely demand. And I don't understand how that analysis is being done. But it's easy to get big numbers if you assume, for example, the Swedish-style direct hydrogen reduction to make sponge iron in steelmaking. I would therefore pay attention to companies, I know of 2 in the United States alone, that are doing electrochemical steel and iron production. One of particular interest by an Indian entrepreneur in Boulder, Colorado, is designed specifically to work with varying renewable electricity, like from a wind farm. The capital cost of the process is very low, so asset utilization is not important. And as the wind power varies, so does the iron production. But it runs at 60 degrees Celsius. It's not like a blast furnace. And a similar process has been developed for magnesium. These electrochemical processes vary voltage and pH to extract whatever metals you want from, for example, ferrous dirt. You do not need high-grade iron ore to make steel by such a method, like the Swedish process does. So this could very much change the primary metals industries and greatly reduce the hydrogen requirements for decarbonizing them. The same is true in cement. I recently saw in rural France a material that an elderly architect was mixing up with his kitchen mixer on the kitchen counter. It is twice the compressional strength and bending strength of conventional concrete, but it requires no heat. And he thinks this is how the pyramids were made. There are several other interesting cement substitutes that go much further than the conventional ones. And alternatively, there's carboxylate chemistry that can enable one calcium atom in ordinary calcium-based cement to take up not 1 but 5 carbon atoms, and thus make cement a net sink, not a net source for carbon. So I think not only structural design efficiency, but new methods of producing the materials will have a huge effect and probably a huge reduction in expected green hydrogen needs, and that means we can do it much faster because we need to build much less of it.
You started your question by, I think, somewhat ironical, saying that things could not be done in Japan, and I think it's a bit frustrating when a professor is making such statements in public. I think one of our problems, and one of the problems in Japan, is that there is a tendency to repeat statements and then believe that they are true just because they are repeated. And one of the statements that I hear very often is that Japan is special and it's such a small country with dense population and mountains and nothing is possible. But it's obviously not correct when you start playing with the numbers. You have fantastic potential for solar and wind on Hokkaido, for example. Enormous areas, fantastic resources. The wind resources are among the best in the world. I made a calculation in 2015 when this argument was raised, and I found that if you use the same area of Japan for solar PV production as you use for golf courses, you'd get more electricity than nuclear power has ever provided in Japan. And golf courses are not particularly necessary or productive or well utilized for that matter. So it's not a matter of shortage of land. It's not a matter of mountainous areas or lack of resources. What you do have a lack of resources of is that you don't have any oil, gas, coal, or uranium. That's the real problem. You have a lot of solar and wind and biomass, and quite a bit of hydropower. What?
It's not a problem that
No.
that Japan is poor in fuels. Japan is immensely rich in renewable energy.
Yeah, exactly.
So forget the fuels.
Yeah.
ありがとうございますという
It drives innovation.
はい、資源がないことこそがね
Indeed. Thank you. That should be utilized as an advantage. What was fun is fossil-based hydrogen. It couldn't be cheaper than fossil, of course. Further questions, Professor Kaniwa, I mentioned your name personally. Thank you very much. From IGIS, I am Kainuma. Thank you very much for the presentation. A follow-up to the discussion. It was an eye-opener for myself. Indeed, there are so many different units, and therefore conversion calculation is difficult. But today it was per barrel, US dollars. That graph was very easy to follow. Thank you for the information. Renewable energy and comparing the price with other energy, as was just discussed, oil plus CCS, coal plus CCS, and the comparison must include the CCS expense, I think, because without calculating or without implementing CCS, net zero is not possible. But that graph was very easy to understand. If such graphs are utilized, we can understand how it is important, how expensive it will be to continue to use fossil. According to the current price, oil $80 to $85 per barrel and 52 to 53 per megawatt hour. I think that was the graph that we observed. On top of that, the CCS expense must also be incorporated. I wonder if you have any information. If not now, I will be happy to hear from you later. If you can produce such graphics, it would be very helpful.
Well, we agree that CCS is quite costly. There are several projects in the world that have failed to perform according to the plans that were there when decisions were taken to start investing. I'm not sure that it is necessary. I think the talk about CCS is often used as an excuse to continue using fossil fuels. And that may actually delay decarbonization and meeting the zero or net zero criteria. In addition to what I said before, that generating a fuel from a fossil fuel with CCS will always be more expensive than using the fossil fuel directly. It's also the fact that if you produce electricity from a fuel produced from fossil fuel with CCS, that is also going to be extremely expensive, while renewable electricity generation can be cheaper than directly using fossil fuels.
And if you had electricity, green electricity, to make green fuels, why not just use the green electricity?
Yeah.
You see, I too love Thomas-san's equivalence graphs, but they were very conservative because electricity can be used directly and extremely efficiently, but crude oil is still several steps away from a useful product like gasoline. You have to refine it and distribute it and store it. And then it is not used nearly as efficiently as electricity to do the same thing, like running a car or a truck. And also, I wanted to pick up a point I don't think we adequately addressed earlier about the so-called harder to abate sectors. If you go to rmi.org/profitable-decarb, you will find a useful paper of 2 years ago on how those sectors are not particularly hard to abate. That is heavy transport and industrial heat. They're just differently hard. And there are good solutions even for the difficult cases. There are now industrial heat pumps with excellent efficiencies well above 200 degrees Celsius. There are, much to my, well, it's now clear that electric heavy trucks will win in essentially all markets, not only light cars. I was surprised the last year doing a lot of research on aviation that clearly the electric aviation will take over the short-haul markets, which are very important. They will get a lot of the medium-length trips, and you would have a good case for a liquid hydrogen airplane only for very long hauls like transoceanic travel. But when you look carefully at the light weighting, the ultralight weighting, and better aerodynamics and better propulsion technologies all coming together now, I think in your lifetime you will probably see revenue traffic across oceans in airplanes driven entirely by solar power. The advances still to be done are that dramatic.
ありがとうございます。トーマスさんの
Thank you very much. Thomas-san's graph or the table was a bit conservative. That was a comment that was given. So there is an advancement of different technologies, which was just explained. Any other questions, please? Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. My name is Hirai from Update Corporation. We are in Minna Denryoku business. So my question is very simple. So everybody's talking about the boiling earth. What do you think about the increasing temperature of the earth? So I listened to Emory-san's lecture 10 years ago. Since I heard the lecture, I feel that we need to be pessimistic about the future. I want to be optimistic about the future. So that's something I would like to ask for your comment on. And even though the technology is there, the focus should be on the design. And in Japan, we don't have the kind of people who can do the integrative design. So it's probably you, Amory-san, who can do the integrative design for Japan. If you can tell us who can provide integrative design for Japan, or what country can provide insights?
We go to Chennai in India to offer a week's course for leading design professors and practitioners from all over India on integrative design. It's a compressed version of my 10-week Stanford course on this subject. And we are talking about similar courses in Sweden and also in Australia. Perhaps there should be one in Japan. But let me differ with you a bit. I think Japan has an extraordinary depth of talent in all kinds of design. It's one of the most distinctive features of your culture. And so much of traditional design in Japan is highly integrative. It's a very rich source of inspiration all my life. And I think with some technical exchange, any designers who don't yet do integrative design could adopt it and adapt it to Japanese conditions very quickly and brilliantly. So I think there is a huge potential for this to be one of Japan's new superpowers.
Thank you. Do you have any comment?
And maybe a comment on the optimism or pessimism remark. I think you should be neither. There is no reason to despair and be pessimistic because we have told today about all the wonderful opportunities. But there is no ground for being optimistic either because it won't happen unless many of us try. And as Amory said, stupidity is an abundant resource. There are lots of negligence and irresponsible behavior around. And unless we come together to learn and to use the opportunities, it won't happen by itself.
Another way to think about this is that the climate science models that drive policy are very conservative. They understate the speed and the runaway potential, the nonlinearity of climate change, deliberately. At the same time, there are climate choice or climate consequence models, which are at least equally conservative the other way. They understate what we can do about climate change. If you offset these two biases, then the race of our lives, as Jeremy Grantham called it, is very much on. It's our race to win. And as Thomas just said, despair and complacency are equally unwarranted. We have a lot of choices to make and a lot of work to do.
ありがとうございます。力強いお言葉をいただきました。
Thank you very much for your powerful words.
Mr. Sueyoshi, we are really running out of time, so it really has to be short, please. Thank you very much, Asuka at Tohoku University. Thank you for the presentation. I shall try to be short. In the U.S., the situation about the U.S. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, I have a question to Amory. The government goal is by 2030, 80% reduction of emission. If the Biden administration is going to continue, do you think that goal under the Inflation Reduction Act will be realized? That would be my first question. And the electricity price under the Inflation Reduction Act, the calculation by some of the U.S. think tanks, like Resource for the Future, they say that the power price will go down. Amory, under the Inflation Reduction Act, do you think that the power price in U.S. will go down? And question 3. And the Inflation Reduction Act, about 40% is criticized as being invested into wasteful areas, according to Professor Jorgensen of Stanford University. I wonder if Amory has any observation that CCS or nuclear, that Inflation Reduction Act is spending money in wasteful sectors.
多分みんなイエスかもしれないですけど。
I thought so. Yes, you would say yes to everything. Thank you for that rapid response.
Said, the good things in the new law are much more important than the bad things. And it was a matter of inevitable political consequence that we would have good and bad mixed together. But the effect will be, already is very powerful. The old projections were like this for renewables. Now they're like this. And this is not just somebody drawing a curve on a piece of paper. It's actual investment decisions, factories being built, contracts being signed, and a great sense of excitement. Interestingly, with much of the activity, most of the benefits going to what we call red states that vote reliably for Republicans, the opposite of the present national administration. I'm not sure things would work quite that way in Japan, but it's actually good politics and it's good for the country. That said, there are a lot of ways of doing things. You don't necessarily need a new national law. You can do a lot in the private sector, in civil society, at a municipal and provincial level of government. There are many ways of getting things done. And that's why I'm so happy that many of you from different backgrounds and organizations are coming together to understand the all renewable opportunities for Japan and the efficiency opportunities, because I think the kinds of talent and drive in this room are what Japan most needs to apply to bring the unique Japanese speed and cohesion that we've seen so often in the past to this biggest challenge that we face today.
ありがとうございます。では、もう
Thank you very much. We have gone beyond the time, so not be pessimistic but not be optimistic. And for all of you here today, if you could transform Japan together with the world. Once again, in this boiling weather, thank you for joining us. So within 50 years, hopefully, it is not as boiling. Let us work together. Once again, thank you very much.